Are you undocumented in the US and looking at the Canadian study permit as a potential immigration pathway to leave the United States? If so, as part of your study permit application, you will have to show proof of ties to your birth country in order to convince the immigration officer you're reviewing your application that you will not stay in Canada after you complete your studies and that you will return to your birth country once you are done. Of course, the challenge here is if you're undocumented, you've probably been in the United States for a really long time, so you might not have those strong traditional ties to your birth country. In this video, I'm going to address two main topics: how to show those proof of ties to your birth country, and also how to craft that explanation letter that gets into describing why you're undocumented and your undocumented history. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Jasmine, and I'm a former undocumented, not documented individual who grew up in the United States and lived there for 19 years. 3 years ago, I made the decision to self-deport from the United States and immigrate to Canada via the study permit. I've navigated the study permit, the post-graduation work permit, and I am now very gratefully a Canadian permanent resident. Because I've been through this entire process and because I'm very passionate about sharing what I've learned with other undocumented folks trying to leave the United States, is that I am making this video. So I really hope you find this information helpful, and please share it with anyone you think might benefit from knowing this information. What does proof of ties mean? Proof of ties refers to the compelling evidence you provide in your application to show that you have strong connections to your birth country, indicating that you will return there after your temporary stay in Canada. The purpose of demonstrating these ties is for the officer reviewing your application to feel convinced that you will not overstay and that you have every intention to return back to your birth country once you complete your studies. Bringing the undocumented perspective to this statement is, when you are undocumented in the US is not your birth country, but you've lived there for a really long time. So in this application, already, just by being undocumented, you're kind of raising questions, or you're raising a flag to the immigration officer being like, what is making me believe in this application that this individual is not going to come to Canada and then become undocumented here? It is through the proof of ties and then the letter of explanation that we'll get into later in this video that you convince the officer that that is not the case. When are proof of ties required? Proof of ties are required as part of a temporary resident application in Canada. Temporary residency allows foreign nationals to stay in Canada for a specific amount of time for purposes of visiting, studying, or working. A visitor visa, study permit, and work permit are examples of temporary residency applications. When you apply for a study permit, you'll also be applying for a temporary resident visa. The temporary resident visa is a document issued by an immigration visa office outside of Canada showing that the holder has satisfied the requirements for admission to Canada as a visitor. TRVs may be for a single or multiple entries. The study permit is what allows you to remain in Canada for a specific purpose, but it is not a travel document. You need a visa to travel to and enter Canada. If you're applying for a temporary visa to come to Canada, whether that be a study permit, work permit, or even a visitor visa, you must show proof of ties to your home country. In this video, I'm focusing on the study permit, but the concepts apply for other TRVs as well. At this point in the video, you're probably wondering, what if my goal is to come to Canada via the study permit and then seek permanent residence after completing my studies? How would I show that I'm going to leave then? That is one of the more common questions that I do get asked, so I do want to address that right now. When you apply for a Canadian study permit, your focus should be on your academic goals and proving that your stay is temporary. As someone who is undocumented, I completely understand what's at stake. Some of you may trigger a 3 or 10-year bar. I have a 10-year bar, so I understand that feeling of wanting to potentially make Canada your permanent home, but that is not the focus of this application. When you submit this application, the immigration officer reviewing the application evaluates your application based on your current educational plans and your intent to return to your home country, birth country, after your studies. So if you focus your application towards permanent residency, it can raise doubts about your commitment to the temporary nature of the permit. The mindset that you need to adopt while completing your study permit application is one that completely plans on leaving Canada after you complete your studies. After you complete your studies, there are different pathways available for you to stay in Canada, and there is absolutely nothing wrong or stopping you from exploring those pathways at a later date. But for the purpose of this application, a permanent status is not the objective. So I've been talking about proof of ties, but what exactly are examples of said ties? I'm going to walk you through some recommended proof of ties for those seeking to come to Canada as international students, but please do not feel discouraged if you don't have any of the items I am about to mention. I'm creating this video for specifically undocumented folks in the US who most likely don't have any of them. And personally, when I was completing my application, I didn't have any of them, so I completely understand that. But I want to still walk you through the traditional recommended ties that consultants or lawyers would encourage you to include, because every story is so different and everybody's undocumented journey is very different. So maybe you have DACA and maybe you have professional work experience. Maybe through advanced parole, you've been to your birth country and can strengthen your application that way. But again, if you have none of them, please don't feel overwhelmed. Please don't feel super anxious. I will go through what you can do if you don't have any of them and how I overcame this barrier, but I do want to walk you through what are recommended proof of ties. Generally speaking, there are 4 main categories within the proof of ties that are usually recommended. The first one, and I would say the biggest one, is family. So having evidence that you have immediate family to return to your birth country. And this is usually a spouse, children, siblings, and parents, so that immediate nuclear family. If you are leaving a spouse or a child, that is a very compelling reason to return back to your birth country, because you wouldn't want to be away from your family. So that's a very strong tie back to your birth country. And if you're in a situation where your family, your immediate family, is actually submitting an application with you, then I guess the next best thing would be talking about your siblings or your parents. But this is a tough one because you might have all of your family with you in the United States, or you might only have more of a distant cousin or aunts that you haven't really spoken to, or no one that's really immediate family to you back in your birth country. So this, you might or might not have this. It really will vary person to person. Another big one is having financial assets. So evidence that you have financial assets in your birth country. And this can be bank statements with money in your name, property in your birth country, that's through a house, land, or rental property. Maybe some of you have terrenos, I don't know, investments, or other significant assets. It will really vary person to person, but it's very likely that if you are, I would say, a young professional or still relatively young, you might not have assets in your birth country, especially if you haven't been there in a really long time. The next one is employment, business, or career prospects. So this is evidence that you have a promising career to return to in your birth country. So this is having a job now and your employer is offering you to have a job to return to after you do some little bit upskilling. Statistics on average salaries and what that salary can afford. So you're not employed yet, but there is a very compelling reason for you to come to Canada, get a quality education, and then take that back to your birth country, which you can then use as a stepping stone to get a better job. There's also maybe a current labor gap or shortages in that area. So what if there's a specific sector in your birth country that you can fill and it's currently in need of workers? That is another very strong reason, because then you'll have a potential career to come back to or go back to in the first place. This one, again, might not apply, because if you're not physically in your birth country and you're in the US and you're undocumented, then well, you don't know about your career prospects immediately, but this is where you can really focus on the, if I come to Canada and get this education, then I can take those skills either to meet that shortage or just generally speaking to fill a specific role. And the last one is community involvement. So evidence that you have strong ties to local organizations. This could be a membership in local organizations or religious groups or other community ties. Again, if you're not physically in your birth country, then you probably don't have them. But who knows, maybe you're part of some network in the US that has a branch of sorts in your birth country. This is a little bit tricky, but I just wanted to include all 4 of them because every story is so unique and you might actually have one of these. Who knows? So based on what I've shared so far, I can anticipate that you're probably wondering, how do I communicate to the officer? Is there an interview? There is no interview. I will talk more about how you're going to communicate this information to the officer in just a few minutes. And the other question that I can anticipate coming up is, what if I don't have any of the proof of ties you just mentioned in the last few slides? And to answer honestly both questions, we are going to get into what's called a letter of explanation or statement of purpose. A letter of explanation or statement of purpose is a personal document you include with your study permit application to give the immigration officer a deeper insight into your situation and intentions. And the main elements within this letter are to explain your circumstance, clarify your intentions, and address any concerns. Being undocumented is going to inherently raise concerns for the officer reviewing your application. So you need to be really upfront and honest about your status. I've always said, and I'll say it again, never lie about your undocumented status. Never try to distort the truth. Never try to be sneaky about it. You need to be upfront and honest, because Canada and the US do share an immigration system. So if you are someone who became undocumented because you overstayed a visa, Canada will know that, whether you include it in your application or not. So it is really best not to lie. Never lie. Always, always, always be honest. As part of you explaining your circumstances in this letter, you're going to describe your background, why you're applying for a study permit, and any unique factors affecting your application. For example, the lack of traditional ties. It'll also be a place for you to clarify your intentions. And by that, it's very, very, very being super, I don't know how to say this, but the purpose is that the officer is going to read your letter, see your entire application, and be like, yes, this person is not going to stay here. This person is definitely going to leave because they have such compelling and strong reasons to go back to their birth country. And it's also going to be the place to address any concerns. So what I always say is that you can't assume that the immigration officer is going to know things about what it means to be undocumented, what's going on in the US around undocumented folks. You have to assume that they know nothing, that they are not going to connect any dots. You have to connect the dots for them. So whatever you include, you need to describe. And you really have to explain and answer questions that they might have, because you're not going to get the chance to talk about them. You have only one shot to answer whatever questions they may think of. So whatever might not be clear to you, it's definitely not going to be clear to them. So you have to answer any questions that could potentially come up. And of course, the biggest one is, what is going to convince me, or pretending I'm an officer reviewing an application, what is going to convince me that you're not going to come to Canada and overstay, that you're going to become undocumented here, or that you're just going to come here and then want to stay? What in your application is going to convince me that after you're done with school, you're going to leave? And to get back to an earlier point, even if your intention is to come to Canada and pursue a permanent status, and you really want to become a permanent resident one day, the focus of this application is not a permanent status. It's a temporary status by coming to Canada to study and leaving after. And once again, once you complete your studies, if you decide to pursue the post-graduation work permit and stay, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do it. But for the purpose of this application, you have to convey that you're going to leave. For this next part, I'm really going to need your undivided attention, because it's so, so, so important. I would say this is probably the heart of your application, especially for undocumented folks applying, because there are so many questions and red flags already presented just by being undocumented. So in this next part, I'm going to walk you through crafting the letter of explanation. And in all honesty, crafting a well-written letter of explanation is extremely important. And once again, technically it's an optional document. It's not optional. You have to write it and you have to include it. If you have any questions about each section that I'm going to walk you through, please let me know in the comments. Once again, I am making this video to support you and your immigration journey, so please do not hesitate to let me know what I can clarify. And honestly, if there is interest, I would be open to maybe hosting a workshop where we can craft our letters of explanation together, using what I've learned throughout my own process and what I think was really important and actually worked in my letter. So please let me know if there's any interest in this, and we can potentially do a workshop. The very first section of your letter of explanation is going to be a very brief introduction. And I just want to say that this letter is not pages long. It's a very short and concise and directly to the point letter. So you have to talk about so many things in the most convincing and strategic and brief possible way. So the first section is the introduction. So who are you? And this is also where you're going to might briefly introduce what school you're going to be attending, the school that you got accepted to, and express very briefly your intentions on what you are doing. So it could be bring the knowledge back to your birth country to strengthen blank field, but just quick intro. And honestly, if you integrate some of these components into the other ones, you might honestly just get to the point. You might not need this extra introduction. The next part is this: what is your educational and professional background? So a brief overview of your schooling up to this point, a brief overview of your career history, a brief overview on what your plans are to take your career to the next level through your Canadian education, and a brief overview of how this educational pursuit is part of a larger picture. You want to connect it to your goals for your life. It's coming to Canada is not just coming to Canada to study. It's coming to Canada to do something bigger. The next component, and it doesn't have to be in this order I'm walking them through, this is just kind of a list you can rearrange as you see fit, but it's answering the question, why do you want to study in Canada? Why are you coming, or why are you interested in coming to Canada specifically to study instead of investing your money in a US education or a education in your birth country? So why are you choosing to come here? It's really important that you address that. And, ways that you could talk about it is like the quality of education, because Canada has some great schools. So quality education, the cultural diversity, maybe the learning opportunities. This is really such an important part. Why Canada? You need to have a really good reason for why you're coming to Canada. And when I did this application, my why Canada was heavily focused in my sector, in my field, and what I wanted to study. Canada only had one school, or I don't know if it still does, but at the time when I applied, there's only one school in Canada, the University of Waterloo, that had a very specific Master of Climate Change program. So why I wanted to come to Canada? I wanted to come to Canada to go to that one specific school, which I feel was very strong, because you are the only country that has it and I want it. So this is why I want to come to you. But, that was just me, because I wanted to focus on that sector, the sector of climate change, and I wanted to work in that field. So that's what I included. But this will vary greatly person to person. The next component to answer is, how will your Canadian studies improve your career opportunities? So what are your plans on how you'll be leveraging the Canadian education back in your birth country? And this can also describe how you'll use that Canadian education to improve your financial prospects, or again, connect to that larger picture. You could say something like, I'll come to Canada, I'll study X, and because I'll have those skills and that education, I can take that back to my birth country and, have this type of career that requires these type of skills that would allow me to, make this type of income that is a livable wage. It really will vary person to person, but it's all about really saying, how is this Canadian education a stepping stone? How is it going to put you in a better position that really strongly connects to your birth country? The next component that you really have to address are those connections to your birth country. So earlier in this video, we talked about those 4 main categories, and this is where in the application you would provide the narrative for them and describe them. And if you don't have them, well, then this part will be a little bit shorter, but you still need to include it. So for me, when I applied, climate change, every country needs to focus and worry and practically work towards addressing climate change. So when I wrote my letter of explanation for this specific component, because I didn't have any of the 4 traditional ties to my birth country, I really focused on how I needed these skills in order to help Mexico fight climate change. And obviously I got into more detail than that, but basically that was the message I was conveying here. That was the tie to my birth country, because my birth country needed professionals to work in this field. The next component that you have to address is if you can afford to come to Canada to study in the first place. One of the other components of a study permit application is the proof of funds. And you'll have different ways to prove that. But it's not just enough to show a bank statement. You have to, once again, provide the narrative for it. So I have, I don't know, $40,000 that will cover my tuition, my living expenses, my groceries. You know, you have to really say what that amount is going to cover. You have to describe the type of proof that you're showing as part of your applications, and really focus on what it's going to cover outside of tuition. Because at the bare minimum, you need the $20,635 per person, plus your first year of tuition, plus your travel expenses. Bare minimum. But the more that you have above that level, the better your chances are, and to make a stronger case for if you can afford to be in Canada in the first place. These last two components, I would say, are probably the most important and the most pertinent to undocumented folks in the US looking to come to Canada via the study permit. And that is answering the question, why are you undocumented? If I was talking to an undocumented person in the US, there's a lot of things that I know about being undocumented. I know there's so many reasons why people become undocumented, but you can't assume that the officer reviewing your application can draw those connections or knows those things. So you need to answer the question, why are you undocumented? So to answer this, you would say, you know, how did you become undocumented? Why did you and your family leave your birth country, go to the US, and become undocumented? And why haven't you adjusted your status? I know, once again, if I was talking to an undocumented person, there is no way to adjust status. There is no pathway towards permanent residency. I know that, but you can't assume that the officer reviewing your application knows that. So you need to answer, why haven't you adjusted your status? Really important things that you can really talk about in this part is, was it your parents that took you to the US? I mean, were you a minor when this happened? When I wrote my letter of explanation, I literally stated that my parents took me to the US when I was 3 years old. I had no say in the matter. I honestly don't even remember it. So I wanted to make it very clear that this isn't a decision that I made. This isn't something that I decided for myself. You know, I was a toddler at the time. Another thing that you can talk about here is, like, was your family fleeing your country? And if so, what was the reason? What reasons did your family have or you have to leave your country? Because, you know, if things were perfect in your birth country, you would not leave. Nobody wakes up and says, you know, today I want to go to the US and become undocumented. No one would ever want that. And again, I know that, you know that, but you can't assume that the immigration officer knows this. You need to tell them. You need to share the story. You need to tell them why. You can also talk about how there is no pathway for undocumented folks in the US. Again, I know that, you know that, but you need to put it on paper so that they know that it's not you, you know, choosing to be undocumented. There are reasons for that led you to be undocumented, and there are reasons for why you are still undocumented today, and those are outside of your control. You can also talk about maybe if you're a DACA recipient, if you would have qualified to be a DACA recipient, but you don't have DACA, how DACA isn't taking applications anymore, or how DACA excluded you when you didn't meet the criteria for whatever reason. But never deviate too far from answering the question why you're undocumented. Don't get into like giving a whole life story. Again, it's quick, concise, to the point. You can also talk about maybe how COVID delayed the processing of applications, and it was because of COVID that you became undocumented, because you couldn't process your application, or because there was a delay in processing applications. There are just so many reasons why people become undocumented, so many stories of undocumented folks. So you need to tell your story. You need to tell your story to answer the question, why are you undocumented, and why haven't you adjusted your status? It's so, so, so important. And the last part of the letter of explanation is the conclusion. Now, the conclusion, I would say, is probably super, super, super important, or as important as answering the question why you're undocumented, because in this final paragraph, you're really tying it up. Any lingering, you're securing the final thought. And what I mean by that is that the officer is going to have reviewed your application, is finishing reading this letter, and the goal is for them to put that down and say, you know what, I feel good about this. This person has a very compelling story. They understand what it's like to be undocumented. And I get the strong impression that under no circumstances would they want to come here and become undocumented because they've been through that hardship. That's kind of like the takeaway message that you want them to have. So as part of this conclusion, and I know this seems silly, but it seems silly, I know, but you have to answer these questions. You need to put it in writing. You cannot assume that the officer reviewing your application is going to make any connections. You literally have to spell it out. And so in this, you literally have to state if you're being honest and upholding integrity. Is everything you said and disclosed in that application true? You have to write it. Will you respect the Canadian immigration laws? Write it. Will you respect the study permit conditions? Also acknowledge and write that. State that upon the completion of your studies, you will return to your birth country. We know that's the goal, and we know that's the intention, and we know that's what they expect out of you, but you need to write it. You need to put it on paper that you are going to leave. And of course, you need to state, and I think this is super, super, super important, that you understand that the study permit is temporary. So there is no question about whether you understand what it means to have a study permit or the conditions that you'll have. You need to put it on paper that you understand that this is temporary. This is not a permanent status that you're applying for. This is a temporary status. Again, if you want to apply for a post-graduation work permit and then later apply for permanent residency, there is nothing wrong with that. I mean, if Canada didn't want that, they wouldn't create a work permit for international students to apply for as soon as they graduate. So that is a pathway. It is not the focus of this application. I really hope that this video answered some of those questions and provided some clarity, and that you're leaving this video feeling a little bit more optimistic, having heard a little bit more from a person who's been through this process. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. And I also ask that you share this video with anyone who you think might benefit from knowing this information. I really want to help as many people as possible, especially during these very troubling times in the US. It takes me honestly right back to when I was there, and it's just a horrible feeling, and I don't think anyone deserves to live in those conditions. I will never encourage anyone to self-deport, and I will never be like, you need to do this, but I do want to equip you with the information, with the awareness. When I was doing this entire process, I didn't know of a single soul who had ever self-deported and gone somewhere outside of their birth country. So now that I've been through this entire process and I'm a Canadian permanent resident now, and I've had the opportunity to live such a beautiful life and have experiences that I would have never imagined or never had I stayed in the US, I just want that for you. But I will never push for anything. This is your decision. Choosing to leave or stay in the United States is an incredible personal decision that you cannot take lightly. But if the Canadian study permit is something you're interested in, you are not alone. I am here for you. I want to help you as much as I can. So please let me know if there's anything else that you would like answered. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.